terms of the rest of the conversation, we spoke a little bit about, or I talked a little bit at the beginning about the responses to homelessness and how the way, and certainly not a surprise to anybody who works in the sector, but the way that we respond collectively as a society to the issue of homelessness is inadequate, both from the standpoint of infection control and from the standpoint of responding in a way that upholds the right to housing of people who are users of the homelessness and support other various support networks by providing them a place to live that reflects human dignity. And the pandemic has only sort of heightened or made that much more obvious. And the third piece that we spent, I would say the bulk of the conversation on, was around the lack of appropriate housing options and the importance of really focusing on the public sector and nonprofit sector to help solve that problem. And so we talked about how municipalities and the province can potentially provide land to contribute to the construction of affordable housing. We talked about how the federal government can focus their investments on really increasing the supply of affordable housing. We talked about the importance of all levels of government partnering with the nonprofit sector to create housing that is affordable and stays affordable over the long term, and in the best case scenario, in perpetuity. And we talked about the importance of keeping affordable housing in place over the long term by establishing things like rent control and improving our eviction prevention programming and services. And so all of that conversation coalesced around a couple of asks in terms of asking levels of government to reserve public lands for affordable housing, increase investment in the nonprofit sector to build permanently affordable housing, and in particular, vis-a-vis the province of Ontario, restoring full rent control and continuing policies that would prevent evictions. So maybe I'll stop there and do a quick check-in and see if that's enough to kind of get us started. Seeing some nods.
It was a great synopsis of our session. Great. So maybe we'll start with if anyone has questions of Alyssa, because she really did a great job of summarizing what we did talk about on June 22nd, and brought us some not great news about current legislation that's going through the House. So if people have any questions on those specifics, we'd start there, and then we'll get into the deep dive. Okay, so not seeing any questions right now. Certainly, Alyssa, you're going to stay with us, so thank you for that.
Janice has a question, sorry.
Oh, Janice has a question.
It wasn't working for me.
Okay, great.
Anyways,
thanks, Janice.
I realize we don't want to talk about it too much, but this new bill I did hear about on Monday, there were protesters downtown, et cetera, and I'm just amazed how quickly such things can be put through at the detriment of other people. But when it's things that are meant to help people, those get delayed, and years and years and years. A 10-year plan that's not even fulfilled right now. But is there a way that we could find, like, if we could stop this from happening? I don't know how we could do that, but is there something that we could develop that can counteract that? Because that's dangerous, what's actually being posed on the innocence of society.
So Alyssa, do you want to speak to that? Because I feel like this is also an opportunity for our group to think about what our advocacy role can be in speaking to these types of proposed pieces of legislation.
Sure, and absolutely. So Janice, I think your observation is really quite astute, that there seems to be a very strong ability to move things along that are going to be quite unhelpful for people. But when we need to help the most vulnerable people, these are the things that end up being kicked around. These are the initiatives that get kicked around government for years without a lot of action. And I say that as somebody who has worked in government, so I've seen it from the inside and the outside. We were quite astonished, and I know that the opposition was quite astonished at how quickly this came forward. There was an understanding that it was going to be on hold for quite some time. It was, you may, if you've been following along, Bill 184 was introduced before the pandemic, and then there was sort of an understanding it was going to be put on hold for a while, and then it came up by surprise for second reading in the House a couple weeks ago, and then they went ahead with the committee hearings. And in terms of legislative process, as you know, there's first reading, second reading, committee hearings, and then third reading, and then the vote. And so this is actually going to third reading. I believe it's this week, and will be voted on. The government has a majority. I do not anticipate, unless some of the recent advocacy has really sort of convinced members of government to vote against the bill. I would be very surprised if they did. And so I'm not sure sort of what opportunities there are at this point to sort of intervene and steer it in a different direction, because it has moved so quickly.
Ross, and make sure to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Yvonne. I'm from Newmarket, involved with an organization called Concerned Citizens for the Homeless in Newmarket. And we got around to commending the government for housing 50 folks at the Kingbridge Conference Center, west of King City, for the sake of infection control over COVID-19. I thought I'd ask you your opinion about that process, please.
All right, yeah, go ahead, Alyssa.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Ross. And I wasn't familiar with your group, and I just I wrote your name down because I'd like to connect with you afterwards and learn a little bit more about what you're doing. I don't know a lot about that particular situation, but what I will say is that I think certainly any efforts to move folks who are not in housing to safe indoor spaces right now is really important. And I think, the city of Toronto, which I'm quite familiar with sort of what's going on there, they've done quite a bit of work in that regard to try to move folks who are currently sleeping outside into safe indoor spaces. And I think that that's really important, both from an infection control standpoint and just from, a basic right, advancing and upholding people's right to housing. I'm not familiar with the space that they've been moved to, so but it sounds like it's a space that's a conference center, so used for other functions, and so it's certainly not a long-term solution. So I think it would be really one of the things that we are really keen to make sure is the case, that this motivation to move people into safe indoor spaces is not limited for the duration of the pandemic, but that this is sort of a new approach to working with and serving our homeless and vulnerable residents, and that those options that people are provided with to the extent possible, not be congregate living settings where infection is likely to spread, but rather that people are in sort of safe standalone units. So without a ton of familiarity about the particular circumstances, those are the thoughts that I have off the top of my head. Yeah.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thanks for asking.
Thanks for the question, Ross. Sean, and you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sure, thanks. Alyssa, I just wondered if you could expand a little bit. You mentioned about the importance of affordable housing and of keeping housing affordable, and if you could say just a couple of words about the kinds of strategies that seem to be most consistent and most reliable in ensuring the long-term affordability of housing instead of just our being able to get short-term affordability.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Sean. And I'll sort of just preface what I'm about to say by saying that I'm fairly, I think, especially considered to many on, compared to many on this call and many around the tables that I sit around, I'm fairly new to housing as a subject area, and I'm certainly not an expert in sort of the finer points of development and construction. But one thing that one observation that I've keep sort of making again and again as I have conversations with people about improving housing options and ensuring affordability, we keep running into this problem where the private sector seems to be either structurally unable or unwilling to provide the kind of affordability periods and the amount of affordability, so both in terms of depth and length of time, that housing advocates in the sector are looking for. And so as a newcomer to this space, but someone who is policy minded, one of the things that I just keep asking myself is if that delivery option is not something that's going to give us what we need, then what other delivery options can we look at? And so what I keep coming back to is, why would we look to a particular type of model where the numbers don't seem to work? Whereas we have the nonprofit sector who seems very interested, willing, able to play a very significant role in this, and is in a much better position to make the numbers work because they don't have to take a cut off the top. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to me. I'm not sure if that's sort of what you were getting at, Sean, but that sort of off the top, just my first response to your question is just that I think we really need to give some serious thought as to how we can structure this in a way that is workable, and I consistently see challenges with that, the feasibility of working with or at least relying primarily on for-profit developers to make this happen.
Thanks, Alyssa. And just a reminder to those of you on the call, if you want to make a comment, ask a question, you can raise your hand. You can use the reaction button at the bottom. You can show up in the participant section by raising your hand there. And a few of us will be paying attention because I'm likely to miss it, but I will be paying as close attention as possible. I don't think we have anybody on the phone, but if we did, no, we don't. So Sean knows that. So we're good on that score, because there's another feature that you have to use to be able for us to hear you. So I'm just gonna lead with a few some questions that we had considered, and because Alyssa's done such a brilliant job of overviewing what we had talked about on the 22nd and some of the recommendations that we put in the summary paper that we circulated to everyone prior to these events. So we had, looking at affordable housing options, the not-for-profit sector, looking at how we can prevent evictions, looking at surplus land as something that federal governments or municipal governments can make available, and trying to keep affordable housing affordable into perpetuity, as opposed to seeing the rise in the increase in rates that make it impossible for people to afford. So we're going to kind of throw out some broad-based kind of discussion starters, but certainly we want to remind people that we are reimagining here, and we want to ask the questions that we probably don't know the answers to, but it's in doing that we elevate the conversation to a different place. We don't have to stay within tight, narrow margins of what we think is doable. I think our obligation is to talk about what we think will solve these problems, and then we can worry about how that would be implemented down the road. So just to the group, what do you consider some of the critical elements of a policy direction that will help us achieve more affordable housing, say just in York Region? Of course, we're talking about right across Canada, but what would be some of the critical pieces of what a policy direction that you would like us to advocate for that could achieve more affordable housing in the region? Or any questions to that statement? Lee. Oh, I see Lee and then Janice. Yep, Lee, go ahead.
So I work at the Legal Clinic of York Region. So a few things that we've seen are as maybe the biggest issues coming up this year are the preservation of affordable housing. And a couple of ideas that have come up or areas are, one, a demolition control bylaw that could be passed by each lower tier municipality where there is affordable housing or affordable market housing. It's becoming more and more attractive to demolish it and replace with more expensive housing. And so if we could convince municipalities to pass these demolition control bylaws, which are pretty common in the GTA, that would be very useful. And also a lot of operating agreements are ending with the federal government for subsidy. We've seen this in most co-ops in the next, starting in 2016 and for the 5 years following that. And also some other nonprofits. So getting a commitment either from the federal government or from the municipality to transition into that would be good. And then I just wanted to also add something to, or respond to Janice's question with respect to Bill 184. A lot of the changes that they're making are going to come as a surprise to tenants when they realize that they've agreed to something that could lead to an eviction. So education for tenants is really useful, and that, you know, refer them to Sarah, refer them to us so that they know what their rights are when they're being offered, you know, a repayment plan, for example. Thanks.
Okay, this is Janice. Hi. It's not really a question per se, or I guess in my head, I'm just thinking that what we lack and need improvement on is actual single units. When I'm thinking about in the RGI world, what I have learned is we have family units that are being utilized by just single occupants, but because there are no single units for these people who have this 3-bedroom townhouse, can't be transferred into a single unit, and in which case the family that's sitting there waiting for that house is not happening. So it's great that we're looking after the families, but we have forgotten about the singles, and there's a vast majority of homeless that are single.
Absolutely. And I think that we often forget about single folks, even when it comes to income security too. But you're pointing out a problem with the system whereby if we can increase those single units, we'll also have more room for families who are becoming increasingly a statistic in the homelessness population. Yes, Mateo.
Hi, sorry, my name's actually Kian. I'm borrowing Mateo's login, I guess, to join the conversation. So if we're discussing reimagining, I guess if we're working with a blank canvas, perhaps modeling what other cities have found success in. So a prime example would be a city like Vienna that has a very strong and a very wide range of public housing options that don't rely on the private sector, that don't even really rely on the nonprofit sector, but they rely on government support for public housing and government building of public housing. So you have a city like Vienna for a world-class first world city, where the rent for a 1-bedroom goes as low as 300 euros a month, because there's a large number of public housing units. So I guess it would be to lobby to push for government spending and building of, as well as just discussed earlier, 1-bedroom units, 2-bedroom units.
That's a good point, and it makes a distinction between what we often think of as the not-for-profit versus the private solution, whereas in Canada up until the 90s, we had the federal government in particular heavily investing in the production of social housing and affordable housing, which came to an end and largely responsible for the situation we're in now. Sean?
Yeah, I was just wanted to chip in another piece of the puzzle, which is the capacity of the municipal governments, who in fairness don't have on their tax base the amount of money it takes to build all the social housing and affordable housing that people need. But they do have a lot of things that they can contribute. And we've mentioned land, which is, I think, really, really important, and the publicly owned lands can play a big role in opening up affordable housing. But there's also a lot of regulatory capacity that municipalities could bring to bear to facilitate affordable housing. Some municipalities waive a lot of the costs and fees, what they often call the soft costs, the development charges and the planning fees and things like that for affordable housing to try and facilitate that. So they don't, it's money they wouldn't have made because somebody wouldn't have built there anyways. And it's money they don't make still, but they get a benefit from it. The other is that the affordable housing development tends to get regulated a lot like housing development that's not in the public interest. And a lot of those regulations are designed to make sure that the public interest and private interest get balanced, and that's an appropriate function for regulation. But when the whole project is designed to achieve a public goal in the public interest, it might make sense to have a slightly different regulatory environment that was a little less time consuming and onerous and expensive, because that part, the balancing between public and private interests, has already been addressed by virtue of the fact that it's a public interest initiative in the first place. And so I'd be curious about seeing, I know a number of municipalities in Canada are doing reviews of their regulatory systems to try and figure out how they are more appropriate in their regulation. They're continuing to regulate folks who need to be regulated because there does need to be that balance between public and private interest, but they're diminishing regulations on those projects that are already in the public interest.
Janice
Thanks,
here.
Sean. Janice, and then I don't know if Janice wanted to say something, but Janice, go ahead. You had your hand up first.
Yes, I know I just lost my trend of thought, so we'll come back to me.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Okay.
Dennis is looking at his computer, so I don't think he had his hand up. Ross, did you have your hand up?
I'd like to address the topic of land, please. In Newmarket, I keep hearing the refrain, there's no land available. I heard a couple of weeks ago, Kathy Crow saying under the emergency rules, that municipalities could confiscate private land that wasn't being developed, that was laying fallow, so to speak. So I'm wondering if you've had any experience when you hear civic leadership say, there is no land, and what you would advise about that.
So I'm certain that's something that's been heard in Toronto from the beginning of time. Did you want to speak to that, Alyssa?
Sure. I'm not sure I have a whole lot to offer, as I'm not particularly familiar with the sort of
Sure.
regulatory regime. It's definitely something that we hear, although there are some active conversations around expropriation as a possible policy tool to sort of for particular parcels of land that are sort of known parcels that there is sort of they've been sort of sitting kind of vacant for quite some time in high needs neighborhoods, and so what I have noticed, I guess what I can offer is that there seems to be quite a bit of discussion around that, and in the short period of time that I've been working on these issues over the past close to 2 years, I've noticed a lot more conversation moving in that direction. So what may have previously seemed quite radical is actually kind of being talked about in places that, in all sorts of policy circles that it may not otherwise have been. And Sean might have some perspective on this as well.
Thanks, Alyssa. Yes, Sean, do you want to add to that?
Sure, yeah. I'm reminded of the work that was going on around the creation of Belinda's Place, and there was the same struggle of, oh my God, we need a women's shelter, but there's no place to put one. But when people reached out to the faith communities and the municipality was willing to sever and rezone, land was people like to say you can't make land anymore, but you actually can. By helping faith communities in particular rezone underused sites and sever existing sites. We've been able to create land for public purposes in York Region before, and there's nothing stopping us from doing that now.
Just to add to that too, I think the other thing that we've been hearing from those that are progressive and want to make advances in this direction at the municipal level, that it's not always just the land, it's also the idea of new developments. And so what would be stopping a municipality from saying that when we're building any new buildings, or if other people are building, why can't we scale up so that any building that's created can also include affordable, 1 second, I have people coming into my house and making a lot of noise. Yes, so we have dogs walking through glass. Just thought I wanted to share that with all of you. So yes, so there's those options. So it's not always just the physical locality, but also the opportunity to be thinking outside of the box and following on developments that are happening, so that we can be asking those questions. What is planned for affordable, and how can we scale up and create those opportunities? I just want to point people to the chat where Ray has provided us with a link to how Vienna cracked the case for affordable housing. It sounds like very much focused on government investment in public housing, as opposed to even the not-for-profit sector picking up and doing the heavy legwork. So does anyone else have any other comments or questions on that part? Or, oh yes, Janice, you got your thought. Great.
Yes, I did. Thank you. And actually, it was a good segue for what you guys are talking about, because one of the things that I often have said, there's in Aurora, there's this Howard Johnson that is just sitting there empty. They are rooms that could very well be turned into single units for, I guess, first priority maybe would be the homeless or whoever. It is also my understanding that Aurora actually owns that property, and it's been sitting empty for I don't even know how long. And the fact that maybe there are some land that some people own who would be willing to sell to the government to place affordable housing. In fact, I actually was in a committee a couple of years ago when a young woman said, hey, I've got so many acres, I'm willing to sell it to you guys or do something so you can develop this. She was willing to offer it, but nothing. I have not heard anything about it since. I don't know this person. I can't reach out to her. But nonetheless, there are people who might be willing to do that. But have we talked to them? I mean, we can just go through the real estate market as another option. Let me just see. So basically, taking any site like the Howard Johnson's and repurposing it is another option. I mean, there's a lot of empty warehouses that can be converted. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, no, and thank you for that, because I know for certain that Ross's group in Newmarket has been looking at that particular, or some folks have been looking at that particular building as a repurposed model. It seems like it's not a live issue at this point in time, because there is other plans for that particular space. But I think what you're talking about is begging the interests of a lot of us to pay attention and to be on top of what we see, ask questions about it, make it well known that there are different parts of the puzzle that need to be put together to be able to develop housing. And one of them is having land, which if you have to purchase that outright is going to be at an incredibly high cost. So I think to your point of just, we have to all be slight investigators in all of this. I have Shakira who would like to say something. So Shakira.
Yes, hi. I work at the Housing Connections office once a week. And what I witness is just a disaster. The number of people every day visiting the place and asking for help. And as someone just mentioned about 1-bedroom units or even bachelor units. When I helped people with their applications, I noticed like for many of them is 10 years of waiting or more is just a normal response from the team from that office to, to tell them, and that makes everyone angry. So keeping that there. Another thing that I noticed when it comes to affordable housing, a few buildings that comes up for people to apply and it will be like a lottery thing for them to win if they win. Thousands of people are applying and just a few units are available to public. Not, you get excited that 150 River Street is is building a big building and there are so many units. No, just a few units are offered to people to apply, and it will be thousands of people. Or the last one that I remember, the Lawrence and Weston Road was another nice building that recently was built, and again, just a few units were offered. And so I'm just wishing that at least if there are a few buildings offered, they have to consider the size of the city. In a city as big as Toronto, and the condition that we are going through, I think we are doing very little to help the homeless or help people who need help.
Thank you, Shakira. And you see that very clearly working on the front line and trying to help people find the needle in the haystack. Pat, are you clicking in to say something?
Yes.
I see. Yes. Okay, there you go. Your turn.
With respect to Howard Johnson, the reason that they were forced out is the place is riddled with asbestos, which was discovered when they wanted to do some upgrades. So the whole building is supposed to come down because of cost. It's just impossible to try and rid it of asbestos.
Okay. Thanks, Pat. There's an explanation. So I just wanted to refer to the chat, and this would be something that would be worth to discuss in any of our sessions, including decent work. So Pam has mentioned community benefits as a way of addressing not only just good jobs in terms of, but in larger projects in any municipality. If your municipality and builders or developers have agreements with the community about what is needed and how to invest back into the community, that might be another way of working to include affordable housing in private development. So it's not something we're very far along in the New York region in terms of talking about. I realize that, but Toronto's had some great success. So I think it's well worth putting on our list of things to look into. And the next comment I have here, international examples of social housing that are working. So again, we're getting lots of great things that are being shared in the chat box here, of course, and inclusionary zoning. And so when it comes to, and Sean, maybe you want to speak to that a little bit, but I think one of the reasons that we might be also taking our sweet time getting to making any headway on this is because the small percentages of affordable housing that developers are being asked to agree to when building are never going to get us where we need to go. So 10 or 15%, and I think those can be waived quite easily depending on what the developer and the municipality work out. But Sean, do you want to say something more about that before we move on to our next question?
Sure, and I'm sorry, my internet's getting kind of wonky, so I've stopped the video so that I can get a more stable sound signal. But we are in the midst of having the provincial government bring forward regulations that control inclusionary zoning, and that's gotten increasingly restrictive both by legislation and by proposed regulation. And you know, there is a lot of possibility. It varies a lot by geography, but municipalities are in the best position to make good choices about how much inclusionary zoning their local housing market can bear. Mm-hmm. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all housing market that goes clear across Ontario. Kennora's housing market is just different from Newmarket's and Markham's. And so hopefully we can dissuade the government from constraining York Region against making choices that fit its housing market. And York Region can use the fact that it's one of the highest growth environments in the entire country to leverage some new affordable housing out of the attraction to this particular region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also just add to that, I mean, we do have the lowest vacancy rate for rental in the GTA, so we have a lot of ground to cover. Just checking to see if there's any other comments there. I wanted to just segue. We have about 15 minutes left. One of our questions today to kind of bring into the conversation, and we've talked a fair bit about what regional and municipal governments can do by way of regulation, demolition bylaws, and other things in terms of eviction. What do we propose would be the best role for the federal government and the provincial government, recognizing that in a lot of cases, it takes all three, especially if we're talking about supportive housing, because you build the housing, you get the land, and you also still have to provide support services, which funding needs to come for, depending on the population you're working with. So can we give some thought to what do we feel like are the best roles and the best policy directions we want to advocate to the province and the federal government for? And again, not restricting it to that question only, but giving some food for thought.
Porque llegué del trabajo y después me puse allá afuera.
Okay, I've got somebody talking. I don't think it's, I want to make sure I can hear who's talking. Is that Kitty? Yes, go ahead.
Hi. I think one way to advocate to the provincial government is to push for the provincial government to reverse its decision on the Ontario Municipal Board, on the OMB's influence and power over the municipalities. For a very brief time prior to the current administration, the OMB's authority over municipal government decisions was taken away, where municipal governments would, move against a development. The developer was able to apply to the OMB, and more or less it was a rubber stamp. And for a brief time, that rubber stamp was taken away, but it was reintroduced. So that would be one way, groups, nonprofits, municipal governments can lobby to try and push to assert their authority back, to take what was taken away from them.
Excellent point. Yes, so we want to make sure that we capture that. Other roles for the provincial government and policy directions, especially as we're emerging from COVID and we've seen what has been done in various ways, or the federal government. And is anyone old enough to remember when the federal government actually really funded housing?
Me.
No.
That makes two of us. Come on, Ross, you must have been old enough to remember that.
I would just say that I think we've talked about a couple here, and I'm just going to reiterate them, which are appropriate regulations around inclusionary zoning would be a good thing to have come from the province, and real rent controls, and the province still seems to be caught in that false dichotomy between rent controls and development, whereas we've had as much development under rent control as we've had without it. In fact, mostly more, if you look at the history of the province of Ontario. But as long as we have vacancy decontrol in particular, and the new legislation coming down the pipe as well, it will be in the interest of landlords to push out tenants, because the average rent for a new unit is 40% higher than the average rent for all units, which means that getting vacant possession of a unit is worth a 40% markup on your property. And you can't ask people who are, in the business of operating rental housing developments to just pass on a 40% bonanza and expect that that's going to happen. And so either you have real rent controls, or we're going to see rents continue to rise at the rate that they've risen. And I'm not sure what the number is from New York region, but I know for Ottawa, for example, even though the guideline increase is still hovering around 2% and has for years, the average rent increase in Ottawa is 18%, and the average rent increase, is 8%. The average rent increase for vacant units is 18%. And we just can't keep units affordable if we don't have ways, if there aren't regulations that make sure that that happens, and the province runs that division.
Thanks, Sean. And something else I just wanted to throw out there too, and it's not something that I have a great deal of information or knowledge about, but they're called REITs, and they're basically agreements, investment strategies, corporations that purchase older buildings or buildings that they want to convert. So it's kind of like your worst form of gentrification, which goes along with what Sean's talking about. So we're seeing more and more people losing their homes because those homes then become condos. And actually, it's pretty appalling, but I've had received information where they're trying to get people to invest in this. This is the best way to invest your money now, because we're going to make lots of money post-COVID. And so you can become a landlord virtually by investing in these REITs. And it's really disturbing. And there goes my dogs again. So I'm going to check the chat. Okay, let's see. So Ray had a question?
I just posted, hi, sorry. I
Hi,
just
Ray.
posted just a couple comments because I noticed that the York Region affordable housing strategy is excellent, and the frequent updates speak to actions and examples of improvement. However, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, like, on one hand, and perhaps I apologize if I'm naive or ignorant to some of the issues related to housing, but I think that as we're progressing and taking a step forward, we're also bleeding on the other end and losing affordable housing opportunities, particularly in the area of community gentrification. We have, in my office, we look after a large community outside of, like, Aurora, Newmarket, East Gwillimbury, King, Silverwood Church, and South Simcoe. And through all of our programs and services, whether it's we have a full-time psychotherapist, whether it's food or energy assistance, whatever it is, 1 in every 2 applicants lives in the patch community in one specific area. And which is why we're looking at opening an extension unit in the Newmarket Plaza to serve that community. So we have a unit in there now that we're preparing. But I know of people who are landlords, friends of mine, and they're all upgrading their homes. And their units now, you know, there's a lot of rentals in that community, and those individuals are going to be pushed out because of rent increases. But where are they going to go? They're going to have to move out of the community. And certainly it's going to, you know, it's going to look better, more favorable on Newmarket because we have less people in need of affordable housing because we're pushing them out into someone else's backyard. So I understand and agree with the need for rent control, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. There's no one simple answer, unfortunately. It's such a complex issue. Sorry, that remark was all over the map.
I just wanted to add to that, actually. What I was going to say was a possibility is for the municipal part could possibly work with private dwellers who might be already having basements apart, but to legalize them more, because in this way, like a nonprofit sector can actually come in and possibly rent their basement, and they can take the control of, you know, the client, so that way the landlord doesn't have to be involved, because as my understanding, nonprofits usually go for legal basement apartments, but there is no incentive for landlords or private dwellers to make their existing basement apartments legal. So maybe an incentive to help them help themselves more so. That's
So incentives, but also we have to recognize that I think maybe, and I might be out of date on this, but 4 municipalities out of 9 have legislation for legal basement apartments. So some have not moved that way. And as a result, you have more families living in unlicensed, unregulated, unsafe apartments than you do people living in regulated, licensed ones. Ross, did you have a comment? And then I want to just go back to the federal role in all of this, because that's the one thing we haven't talked a whole lot about, and then start to kind of move us on to where we want to focus our attention and who needs to hear these recommendations. So Ross?
I just want to say a couple of things, please. The focus on Newmarket lately has been very much appreciated by me. There's a member of our group who has an accessory dwelling unit in her basement, but she's aware of at least 6 other units on the street that are not legal. So to encourage people to meet the standards and provide safe accommodation in Newmarket, is a priority in my mind. But previously, we were discussing about the policy with respect to federal and provincial and municipal governments. And the highlighting of the homelessness issue on TVO over the last 4 months, I'll say, has been actually superb in my mind.
Mhm.
I can hardly keep up with the detail. I'm hoping some folks can. I'm thinking of the program between comparing the city of Quebec City and the city of Hamilton with respect to regulations, and finding that the process in Quebec City contributed to a diminishment of the homeless population there. So I just really think some of the policy issues have been well publicized, and I could do more through the TVO efforts.
Yeah, it's been incredible education for anybody that wanted to take all those sessions in, and they are available for people to check out on the agenda, which is the show where they've featured so many of those. So I'm going to throw back out just one more time what people's recommendations or ideas around asking the federal government to play a role or more of a role in this work, as well as, so you can speak to that, or we're transitioning to where we need to identify, and we will come up with a summary of recommendations from what we've heard today. This has been a really robust conversation. So I barely had to prod you because you guys had lots to say. But what would be, who would want to be involved in doing this work? And more importantly, who do we need to target as far as hearing what we're saying about the need for changes to regulation, inclusionary zoning, funding, not-for-profits getting into the game? What are people's thoughts on those things? And I may have done what my kids always say I do. I ask 4 questions at once and they're not sure which one to answer. 5. Okay, there you go. I just heard from the experts in the back here.
Well, I'm happy to start because just on the middle question, because I think it's one of the ones that's key, which is who do we need to talk to try and move this along? And I just think we're really, really exceptionally fortunate in York Region because the amount of senior government representation in York Region is very, very, very high. There's the GTA caucus chair and 3 senior cabinet ministers. That's a lot of people to be able to talk to in the provincial government. And so I think one of the steps needs to be to reach out to the MPPs in the area, and in particular the cabinet members and caucus leaders in the area, and make sure that they're aware that people have deep, deep concerns about the housing situation, and that in this window where the province has been comparatively nimble and relatively creative as they guide us through a pandemic, they've got a real opportunity to move this file forward. I think the same is essentially true at the federal level, and I think those conversations really need to happen in a very focused and urgent way, because they are, I think, as we speak, trying to figure out what their recovery plans look like. It would be great for them to hear from their constituents.
That was echoed in the chat with Danielle, because she said we need to talk to different MPs and MPPs. Everything that someone says makes you think of something else. And I think that we know this is a global problem. It's the financialization or commodification of housing. So there is a message to be sent to all levels. And I think this has been a great opportunity to hear from people about the specific recommendations. We'd love to have a group of you, or those that are most interested, join us as we develop this position or summary statement to be able to take it forward to some of those folks. So if you're interested and you want to indicate that in the chat, send us an email to myself, Social Planning Council, York Reed, Social Planning Council YR at gmail.com. Get a hold of Sean or Kate. And also, someone has just mentioned, and this is important to also recognize, have you heard about the provincial government that's giving $4 million to GTTI for a project? And that is an exciting project that's just been announced with input with a lot of funding from the provincial government, the federal government, and the town of Georgina. it's a trade school. So it's essentially a campus that will train 200 students a year, but they're going to build modular or small bungalows as a way of teaching the trades and also contributing some stock to the housing situation in New York Region. So you can all throw your hands up and we'll be back in touch with you to continue the conversation. Did anyone have any last thoughts or comments before we close out today? We've recorded the session, so it's there for others to take a look at. And I just want to make sure I don't want to miss anyone who might have tried to get our attention. Who was that?
I just have a question about the York region. What about Habitat for Humanity? That one is very helpful, but they started to get money for new home buyers. So they're not gonna offer that free option anymore. They ask anyone who's in that plan or who has applied, they should be able to afford at least 40% or borrow money from the bank. So 60% comes from Habitat for Humanity, the 40% comes from the banks or from the individual if they have any extra money. So is like the York region has, enough space or land to offer. I don't know if there is any way, any level of the government or the city can help encourage that. That also can help many people or many families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Shakira. And they're not on the call today, but Habitat Works is working closely with Blue Door Shelter, who's just renamed themselves Blue Door Support Services. So I'm not really up on their current situation, but they're definitely worth having as a partner at the table because of all the experience they have in doing this work. I'm seeing in the chat that they are having some financial struggles right at this time. So that might be another reason that they've moved and changed their model a little bit. So I think what we're going to do, we have one more question. Oh, one more comment. In addition to vacancy, decontrol of rents from natural turnover, landlords now play the odds that tenants won't or can't return following renovations. So the new term is renoviction, right? So a lot of things working against people, and unless people who are very vulnerable have access to information and those to advocate for them, even more vulnerable at this time. So that's of real concern. So we look forward to receiving your emails, to seeing you on the future sessions next week. Because again, a lot of this stuff is interconnected. It's hard to afford any kind of rent when you don't have a decent job or an adequate income. And I just want to remind people too that the Social Planning Council recently started a new coalition or is working with a number, about 30 different organizations in the region to form the Affordable Housing Coalition of York Region. It's new, and it's it's our attempt to really raise awareness about the right to the right to housing writ large, and how we can move forward at a municipal regional level to work with partners to be able to increase the level of housing stock in the region.
Can I have just one last comment?
Sure. Yeah.
The landlords, nowadays, everyone who has some extra money and has a house is renting, and they have zero information or zero knowledge of how to deal with tenants. They abuse, they do many wrong things that is not acceptable. The same way that we can't drive our car if we don't have a license, whoever is asking, is willing to rent their basement or a room or any way that they are trying to rent their place, they have to have some kind of, they have to pass a test that they know the rules, they know the law, and they know how to, to not take advantage of people. So that has to, I don't know how, maybe it is not easy, but I'm gonna request if we do something about it.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Shakira. We will add that to our list of things. And I know the legal clinic works on that quite a lot, so you can definitely be in touch with them. But the problem is much bigger than any one organization can solve. Absolutely. I also just don't want to miss an opportunity to thank Alyssa again for joining us. We really appreciate your contribution. It's been incredible. And we'll be calling on you at another time, I'm sure. So thank you.
Thanks. It was a real pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to continuing to talk about all this.
That's great. Thanks. So everybody have a great evening. Thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week at another session on housing, decent work, or the not-for-profit sector. Have a great evening, everybody.